So hello, everyone, and welcome to another conversation of the fifth cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. My name is Maria da Piedade Ferreira, and today I am very glad and honored to introduce you to Vinod Goel. Vinod Goel completed his first degree in architecture and then pursued a PhD in cognitive science at UC Berkeley, followed by postdoctoral training in neuroscience at the NIH and the Wellcome Department of Cognitive Neurology, UCL, UK. Over the past 25 years, he has made significant empirical contributions to our understanding of the neural basis of rationality using the methodologies of fMRI and lesion studies. He is a professor of cognitive neuroscience at York University, Toronto, Canada. Vinod, thank you so much for accepting this invitation and being with us today, sharing your work and also presenting your book, your most recent book.
Okay, thank you, Maria. So I'll share the screen and begin. So I'm sharing my screen properly?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, so again, let me begin by thanking you, Maria, for inviting me. And what I'd like to do today is to discuss a model of behavior with you that I call tethered rationality. Now, you all use a model of behavior called rationality. And what I want to do is to try to convince you to exchange your model of rationality for one of tethered rationality, okay? And so these ideas are developed in this book, Reason and Less, that came out last year. And it takes me about 400 pages to sort of articulate them in some detail. So I'm going to present them to you in about 45 to 50 minutes. So it's a big picture talk. And if you find something interesting that you want to sort of focus on or more details about, of course, ask me during the question period or afterwards by email. Also, you can download the book. The book is actually available open access directly from the MIT Press website. Okay. So let me begin with the take-home message. Basically, what I'm going to tell you is that volitional human behavior is a blended response of reasoning and non-reasoning systems. Any satisfactory explanations of teenage daughters, judges making decisions, MAGA supporters, Brexit, that is, any real-world behavior must incorporate both components. Most existing models of behavior recognize only reason. And it comes in different flavors like fast and slow, heuristic, formal, motivated reasoning, and so forth. The tethered rationality model integrates reason into evolutionarily older systems, allowing for what I call a blended response. Okay. So this book began some years ago. I had a bit of a crisis when it occurred to me that despite studying rationality and human behavior for 20 plus years, nothing I knew seemed relevant to explaining the behavior of my teenage daughter or my Trump supporting neighbors who profess an unshakable faith in American exceptionalism, but then deny and ridicule the signs of climate change that emerges from exceptional American institutions. Or why 30% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men over 6'3" tall, when only 3% of the American population consists of white men over 6'3" tall. Or why intelligent, powerful men engage in sexual indiscretion, even assault, at the expense of personal risk and harm to others. Or why I overindulge in chocolate cake and pizza despite being overweight. So on the standard models of reasoning and rationality, one can only appeal to heuristics, motivated reasoning, sloppy reasoning, poor education, perhaps cognitive deficiency. Right? So essentially what you've got you've got a model of rationality, and these are just tweaks to the model. Okay, and this has been standard fare for decades. And what I'm saying is that these explanations do have a role to play in understanding human behavior. It's not that you sort of I'm throwing them away. No, but what I really want to say is that for many real-world behaviors, perhaps the most interesting ones, they miss the mark. Once you are beyond syllogisms and the Linda problem, then these types of this type of model doesn't get you very far. Okay, so what do I want to do? I want to go back and reclaim a very old idea. Okay, it's an idea that you all know. And it's an idea that we took for granted. It was part of our intellectual heritage up until about 70 years ago, when I think it was discarded by the social sciences. So let me go back to this example from the previous page. So this, the 3% of the American population consists of white men over 6 feet 3 inches tall, yet 30% of CEOs or of American Fortune 500 companies are white men over 6 foot 3 inches tall. Now, it's logically possible that white men over 6 foot 3 inches tall are smarter and better equipped to run large corporations than the rest of us. It is logically possible, but it doesn't seem very plausible, right? Perhaps there's something else going on, such as alpha male cues affecting the selection process, the selection decision, okay? And so here I want to sort of remind you of what St. Paul said in Romans 7:23. But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into the captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. Slightly different context, but the same sort of idea, same dilemma, right? And as I said, this is a very old idea and the social sciences have recklessly discarded it. And I want to try to convince you to need to go back and re-embrace a variation of this idea. Okay, so this is the sort of this diagram here is how the idea was initially, I think, stated. This is sort of the control structure. So reason is God's grace. It's up here. It floats above the animal passions. If you're human, you have both. If you're non-human, you only have the animal passions. Okay, so what I want to do is, first of all, the problem is that the standard model falls short in explaining much of real world human behavior. The remedy is to incorporate non-reasoning systems into the model and a blended response hypothesis. This is what I'm going to convince you of. And to make my case, I have to provide you with some data and some arguments. So I'm going to, first of all, provide you with some data supporting the blended response hypothesis. Secondly, I'm going to provide you with data from evolutionary and anatomical evidence for tethered brain-mind systems. Third, how do these different systems communicate and interact? Okay. And fourth, what is the control structure? Who is in charge of the tethered mind? And then finally, I'll go back and explain a couple of real-world behaviors with the tethered mind. Okay, and offer you a very brief conclusion. Okay, so let's introduce Darwin to St. Paul. So unlike bats and baboons, we are reasoning animals. I'm 100% on board with this, okay? But our system of reason does not float above the biology. It is not powered by angel dust. It evolved on top of and is integrated into the neurobiology we share with our common ancestors with bats and baboons. That is, our reasoning mind is tethered to evolutionary older systems, such as the autonomic system, the instinctive system, and associative systems. To deny this, as some of the social sciences seem to want to do, is to deny the theory of evolution and 150 years of neurobiology. So I take this to be a truism. The tethering is not a flaw to be ignored as noise or a fine-grained question for another day. It is how the system works. It's fundamental to understanding behavior. So the question is, how do we cash this out in terms of a model of behavior? My response is the model of tethered rationality, where human behavior is a blended response of reasoning and non-reasoning system. So let me begin by reminding you what we mean by reasoning systems or rationality. Okay, and this is nothing new, very standard characterization. So human behavior on the standard account is explained in terms of reason or rationality. And by this is meant that our actions are a function of our beliefs, goals and desires, and a principle of coherence, which allows us to select actions consistent with the latter, given the former. So for me, coherence is an intuitive notion, meaning roughly making sense. It's a relationship between mental states with propositional contents and more generally propositions. It can be further subdivided into semantic, logical, conceptual, including causal coherence. Okay. So let's begin with this example of judges making parole decisions and applying the standard reasoning model to it. So here the judge will begin with some desire, such as uphold the law and protect society. They will also have some information or beliefs. So for example, they may, the applicant has served the mandatory minimum sentence, was an exemplary prisoner, is not likely to reoffend. There's no objecting statement from the victim. And based upon that, the desire and these beliefs, you apply the coherence relation, and that results in a decision or an action. Now, the important thing to note here, there's several important things. The first is only the reasoning mind can do this, right? So the reasoning mind is absolutely essential. Right? And the only lever for changing behavior within this type of model is to change beliefs. Now you can change desires, but that's a slightly different issue, but certainly by changing beliefs. And this is an abstraction that just floats above the biology. It's totally disconnected from the explanation of non-human animals, the behavior of non-human animals. Okay, so let me now introduce a data point. Again, using the parole judge's model. Right? So there's a famous study by Danziger et al. 2011, studying the behavior, the decision-making of these experienced parole judges. And they note that directly after a food break, after they'd had lunch or a snack or something, favorable parole decisions were about 65%. They dropped to 0 prior to a food break. The reasoning mind cannot explain this, and it's not noise. Okay, you need to appeal to non-reasoning systems, presumably explain it, presumably low blood sugar level, modulating the reasoning process. But how does low blood sugar level modulate this process? It just involves beliefs and desires and coherence relationships. There is no connection to the rest of the biology. There is no way of allowing for this type of interaction. So you just have to consider it as noise. And I believe Kahneman has a book called Noise. I haven't read it, but maybe this is the types of things he might be wanting to explain there, but I've not read the book, so I can't say. Okay, so I want to talk about reasoning and non-reasoning systems. And by non-reasoning systems, if we go back to the past 100 years, what we've studied is we've identified autonomic systems, instinctive systems, associative systems, and by reasoning systems, we're talking about the cognitive systems, right? And what's important here is actually the details of how we characterize these systems do matter for the details of the story. But for us, we have to sort of abstract away from the details. But I do want to point out my characterization of each of these systems is pretty standard. And these are some of the key players that have advanced our understanding of these systems. That's the first thing. Secondly, I want to point out is that these are very different systems, different underlying mechanisms. So autonomic systems are about reflex arcs and homeostasis. Instinctive systems are about fixed action patterns triggered by reward and arousal systems. Associative systems are about learning through reinforcement, co-occurrence relations, in fact. And reasoning cognitive systems are about coherence relations between propositional attitudes. Okay. And in the book, I go to great lengths to argue that these 4 distinct systems can be differentiated actually along 5 lines. And the 5 lines are what is the function of the behavior? What is the origin of the behavior? How tight is the causal coupling between stimulus and response? This is a particularly important one. And what are the underlying mechanisms of the behavior? And what brain structures realize these mechanisms? Okay, so I do regard them as very different systems, underlying mechanisms, a different sort of phylogenetic history, but they're also integrated into each other. Okay, that's sort of the story I want to tell. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the history of psychology, you find that these systems were articulated by some of the smartest people who've ever lived, but they all made the same human mistake, a very human mistake. They all assumed they were right and everyone else was completely wrong. It never occurred to them that they were just explaining different aspects of behavior, right? So if you go back to this list, this diagram here, there's only one name that really appears twice here, and that's William James. And he recognized both the importance of instinctive systems and associative systems in humans. But Chomsky certainly didn't, Skinner certainly didn't, Lorenz certainly didn't, so they were all sort of falling into the same trap. And so the history of psychology is one of proposing mechanisms to explain a specific task, fleshing it out, and then trying to explain everything with it. Then someone focusing on a different task or behavior comes along with a new mechanism, discards the old one, and even though it explained other aspects of behavior very well, and the new mechanism is stretched to explain everything and ultimately fails, and the cycle is repeated, right? This is the last 100 years of psychology. So my first contribution is simply to note that all of these systems have a distinct role to play in animal behavior, including human behavior. The question is not which is the correct mechanism to explain human behavior, but how they interact to generate behavior. And this has got to be a truism. This is nothing new. But when we actually do the work and build our models, we don't, we ignore this. We forget this. So a preview of where I'm going with this. So I want to sort of promote this model I call tethered, the tethered mind or tethered rationality. And the idea here is that our behavioral response to any given stimuli is a function of each of these systems, will be affected by the environmental input to some extent, and they will have some sort of input into the behavior. Okay. So let's build up. And another way of seeing this is again with the the CEO example. You can have this sort of your conscious model here, and want to elect a leader who will grow the company. Then you have certain beliefs, extensive experience. This candidate has extensive experience, double the stock price at the previous company, is highly regarded in the industry. Okay, and then you also have these instinctual biases built in that come into play, such as alpha male cues, and that also modulate the decision. Okay, so this is the type of model we're going for. So to convince you of this, I need to do a number of things. I need to provide you with data supporting the blended response hypothesis, data supporting joint emergence of certain behaviors and corresponding neuroanatomical structures along the phylogenetic tree, a lingua franca for communications across the multiple systems, because I made a point of saying they're very different systems, a control structure for the tethered mind, and then show you how the model explains some of the examples I'm concerned about. So the first point, data supporting the blended response hypothesis. Now here, I want to just begin by, just provide you with some intuitive data points. So for example, low blood sugar level triggers food foraging behavior in humans and non-human animals. The autonomic interaction of the autonomic and reasoning minds, the Pearl judge data shows you that. Instinctive and associative mind interactions. Well, look at the learning of songbirds in male zebra finches. The production of the song is instinctive, but it's fine-tuned based on hearing the father's song. Human language learning, presumably or arguably, has the same features. Or the instinctive and the reasoning mind interacting. Well, the CEO example above. Or another simple example, I'm afraid of lions, instinctively afraid of lions. But I'll go to the zoo and stand in front of a lion cage because I know, my reasoning mind knows that the lion is behind iron bars or plexiglass and can't get out to harm me. Right? Now, in the book, what I do is I spend a great deal of time going through the data from economic decision-making tasks. such as from Ernst Fair, Martin Novak, and others, to argue that what they are really talking about here is the only way they can explain the economic decision-making data in tasks. I don't have the details here. In tasks such as the trust game, and sort of the classic games that they study, the dictator game and so forth, is by bringing in certain instincts such as fairness, cheater detection, punishment, but also reason. When they talk about the reputation, right, plays a very important role in the behavior, human behavior in these games. And that's beliefs. So that's the reasoning mind. And so you can only explain this data by appealing to both reasoning and non-reasoning systems. Okay, so that's all I'm going to really say, because as I say, I don't have time to provide you with details, sort of a big picture talk. Second, data supporting joint emergence of certain behaviors and corresponding neuroanatomical structure along the phylogenetic tree. Okay. So all vertebrate brains consist of a spinal cord, myencephalon, metencephalon, mesencephalon, diencephalon, and telencephalon. You can sort of see this here. And at every branch of the tree, certain brain structures are conserved and propagated, while others are added, modified, and expanded in new directions. So here you can see from going from reptile to rodent to bird that what's essentially preserved are these subcortical structures here, brainstem structures here. And what is modified and in different ways, depending on which branch of the tree you're on, here is the telencephalon. So some of the subcortical structures, some of the cortical structures, and they get modified extensively and in different ways. And here you can see from rodents to human, further expansion, modification, and expansion of them. Now, it's also the case that certain behaviors are preserved and propagated at branching points, while others are added, modified, and expanded in new directions. So again, look at the behaviors difference between reptiles and rodents and humans, or humans and birds. So the correspondence between the anatomy, the brain anatomy and behavior, is not an accident. Hierarchically organized behaviors are underwritten by hierarchically organized brain structures. And in the human brain, we can sort of see this. If we look at here, the sort of the spinal cord, brainstem, and some subcortical structures. Sorry, here brainstem, subcortical structures here, and here, and then the cortex. So in terms of function, so the brainstem, we're looking at autonomic systems such as cardiovascular, respiratory, digestion, pain sensitivity, pathways for conducting sensory information, including pain and pleasure. In the diencephalon, it's sort of the major relay center for sensory information, hearing, vision, smell, touch. So, and then the information traveling between spinal cord, medulla, and cerebrum. Subcortical structures, part of the hedonic reward systems, genetically encoded instinctive behaviors. Hippocampus lays down associative memories, and cerebral cortex be associated with higher level reasoning functions. Now, of course, many non-human animals have cerebral cortex, but not higher level reasoning functions. And there is a story, we don't fully understand the story, about what is different about our cerebral cortex. Now, so here I'm saying that certain functions are associated with certain brain structures, which appear at different times in the phylogenetic tree, okay? But they're also integrated. Each of these structures is integrated and tethered to the structures below. And so here's a simple example of tethering from a simple behavior like moving my finger. That requires signals from the cerebral cortex, motor cortex, thalamus, basal ganglia, cerebrum, brainstem, all the way through, right? And it's no different for something like reasoning or rationality. And we know this, and yet our models don't seem to pay much attention to it. That is, our model reasoning don't seem to pay much attention to it. So at the brain structural level, the way I'm viewing the world is something like this. So here we've got certain brain structures: brainstem, diencephalon, subcortical structures, primary cortex, secondary cortex, associative cortex. And there are certain neuronal properties associated with these different structures. They differ. And in particular, the property they differ on is what is colloquially called hardwired and soft-wired. And but really what's going on is it's the term, I mean, I prefer the term by Greenog, experience-dependent networks and experience-expectant networks. So these hardwired networks are really experience-expectant networks. They expect the world to be a certain way, and they're wired up for that. These networks get wired up by interacting with the world. Okay, and but as I said, that there is a sort of a mapping there, and then these types of reflexive systems, instinctive systems, more solely rely upon experience expectant networks. The associative system, reasoning mind, more on the experience dependent networks. And again, you've got interaction, input from the world coming in, but one sort of response. So there's not four responses, or that an animal is making. There's one behavior associated with the perturbation. Okay, so if you've got these four systems, and again, I'm not wed to four systems. It could be three, so it could be 5 systems, 7 systems. I don't know, but these are the 4 that have been studied. Then you need some sort of language for communication across these multiple systems if you're going to have a blended response, right? And here I want to draw upon heavily the work of Panksepp and several other neuroscientists who I'll mention briefly. And here's a quote: "Many choose to ignore the likelihood that raw affective experiences, primal manifestations of mind, are natural functions of mammalian brains, which could serve as key empirical entry points for understanding the experienced reward and punishment functions of the human mind. To proceed on this track, investigators would need to accept one grand but empirically robust premise, that higher aspects of the human mind are still strongly linked to basic neurophysiological processes of lower animal minds." Okay, so the puzzle here is, how do qualitatively distinct systems based on different principles and mechanisms generate a blended response? Because the autonomic mind, I've said, is based on homeostasis reflex arcs. The instinctive mind is explained in terms of fixed action patterns triggered by reward and arousal systems. The associative mind is about learning through reinforcement. The reasoning mind is about coherence relations between propositional attitudes. But despite multiple systems, behavior consists of a single blended response. Now, I'm repeating myself here, but intentionally to drive home this point. So this implies a global integration function that takes input from each system and determines the blended response. The conundrum is to explain how there can be integration across the levels in the absence of a common language. And here I want to propose introduce a very controversial answer to this question, or this puzzle. And the answer I want to propose is that feelings provide the common currency, allowing for communication across levels for calculation of overall response to a given situation. So, I mean, this is very problematic for a number of reasons. I mean, a number of challenges here. But first of all, what are feelings? So by feelings, I mean, I want to span the range of sensations, from the kink in my neck, the sunshine on my face, the hunger pangs, the taste of chocolate cake, sexual arousal, and pangs of jealousy and anger. Okay, which are emotions. But feelings are not emotions, though emotional states have feelings. This is important. So feelings share valence, physical arousal, and duration components with emotions. But unlike feelings, emotions also have intentional objects, physiological expressions, and cognitive antecedents associated with them. So let me say a little bit about the origins and functions of feeling. Here I'm, again, I draw heavily in the book on the work from Panksepp and Kringelbach and Burridge and Papp. These are all neuroscientists that work with rodents. And what the story that's emerging from this work is that feelings are generated in the brainstem, diencephalon, and subcortical structures, which appeared very early and have been conserved, certainly in mammals and perhaps all vertebrates. Thus, feelings may be widely available along the phylogenetic tree. Okay. Here, this is a rat brain. This is a human brain. Famous experiments from the 1950s. You insert a probe, electric, and provide electric shock in this area of the nucleus accumbens in the rat, and the rats like it. They will work for it. This is a human brain. Here, you insert a probe and provide electric shock in a similar area. In this particular case, the individual felt sexual arousal. Again, so, and of course, this was not done as an experiment. It was done as part of a surgical procedure. But the point is, the similar structures in the rat brain and the human brain are similar functions. And these structures in here are very much devoted to generating feelings. Now, the question is, brain systems are very expensive to maintain. So, and why should these feeling systems be conserved and propagated throughout the phylogenetic tree? And one answer to this question that I provide in the book is that feelings are evolution's solution to selecting and initiating actions, i.e., they're causally efficacious. Again, that's a very problematic claim also. So what's the evidence for feelings being causally efficacious? Well, there is no knockdown argument for the claim, okay, that feelings are causally efficacious. But I think there are some data points that support this. So first of all, feelings are generated, as I've already said, in brainstem structures widely available along the phylogenetic tree. When these feeling circuits are artificially stimulated, the animals will work to maintain the stimulation. The stimulation of the circuits can be used as reward to condition the animal's behavior. Animals develop place preference or aversion as a result of the stimulation, and animals will work harder, run faster, the more pleasurable they find the stimulation. Okay? And again, nature is not prodigal, yet feeling circuits have been preserved despite the heavy metabolic cost of maintaining them. Therefore, they must have some adaptive function. And the function I'm suggesting is motivating and selecting behavior. Let me give you an example of how this system works, and using taste or energy management, weight management as an example. So consider the oral sensory system of taste discrimination. This is how it begins. Sweetness signals fast releasing carbohydrate energy sources, such as ripe fruit, and motivates consumption. The taste and texture of fat signals high density energy sources. Bitterness signals the presence of noxious toxins such as poisons. Okay, so taste serves as the interface and guardian between the external environment of potential foods and our internal bodily environment. And we actually understand the the neuroscience and neurochemistry underlying this reasonably well. So that's half of the story, what to eat. But why should you eat? What motivates us to eat or to engage in any action? Well, so the taste system guides my selection, but how do I know when and what to eat? Why should I bother? Feelings of reward, wanting and liking and aversion, serve as intervening variables between stimulus and response. And again, this very heavily relies on work of Kringelbach and Burridge. In the case of energy management, homeostatic system signals it is time to eat by generating hunger pangs. This is a restless, unpleasant, agitating feeling which the organism wants to get rid of. Its function is to make us care about initiating or stopping an action. It does so by being directly connected to certain behaviors controlled by instinctive, associative, and reasoning systems. These feelings are drivers, motivators, and inhibitors. They activate certain action tendencies, which result in the organism eventually undertaking the actions to procure and ingest food. Okay, so this is sort of established neuroscience, right? This is nothing new there. Now, what I want to do is I want to come back and look at each of these systems and say what are the role feelings are playing in there. And so again, when we're looking at autonomic systems, look at hunger pangs, your heart racing. Whenever the autonomic system requires intervention of the other systems, it is through through feelings. The instinctive mind, think of taste, lust, or your child in distress, right? Instinctive behavior is not like an unfelt reflex, but involves an element of appetite, aversion, or both. In the associative mind, think of, the behaviorist cannot explain reinforcement in a non-circular way without having the animal distinguish positive and negative valence and prefer the former. Paul Young, who was a behaviorist, also worked in the 50s and 60s, he did a very very elegant series of experiments in which he, first of all, isolated which foods rats preferred, and then he showed that when they were trained with the foods that they liked better, they learned more quickly, fewer trials. They worked harder, they ran faster, they pushed harder. So it makes a difference. Now, what about the reasoning mind? Again, so here I have to sort of leave behind the neuroscience, and this is more conjecture. I want to claim that reason is also about feelings ultimately. This is an extremely controversial claim that I'm making here. Now, one obvious entry point of the feelings into reason everyone will accept are emotions. So I'm going to set those aside. But what about beliefs, desires, and coherence relations? Well, I argue in the book that desires are cognitive versions of, Panksepp's seeking system, or the Kringelbach and Berridge's reward system. There's something it feels like to want to complete this book or write this article or get this research grant. Beliefs also, again, traditionally philosophy has not associated feelings or affect with beliefs and desires, but I think beliefs, arguments like John Searle's Chinese room argument, suggest that there are feelings associated with beliefs. That's why the argument works. That's what it hinges upon. Okay. Then coherence. All logical intuitions come down to a feeling of rightness, I think. Coherence feels right, positive valence. Incoherence or inconsistency feels wrong, negative valence. So, and let me try to motivate this last point for you. So consider the following proposition. Either Socrates is mortal, or it's not the case that Socrates is mortal. You are all certain that it is true. But if I refuse to accept its truth and ask you to prove it to me, in classical logic, all you can do is appeal to the principle of the excluded middle. If I refuse to accept the principle, what do? There is no further proof. The principle is meant to be self-evident. It is accepted because it feels right. As logician Clarence Irving Lewis noted, when a point of logic is in question, the only thing we can do is appeal to intuition. But why should this be? Why should there be a feeling associated with coherence relations? Well, as in the case of taste, feeling is fitness enhancing. The coherency feels good because representations that are internally consistent and veridical will enhance survival. Incoherency is unpleasant because it can be harmful. Okay, so that's so much for the communication system, how these systems communicate through feelings. Finally, it's the control structure, and I won't bother with these, except maybe the last one, the Jeremy Bentham. This is the idea that I use in terms of the control structure. So I reject the executive functions idea. This is the first one, Jerry Fodor. If in short, there's a community of computers living in my head, there had also better be somebody who's in charge, and by God, it had better be me, right? This is the executive function idea. The idea, I'm rejecting that. I'm going with the Jeremy Bentham idea. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Okay, so again, this is the diagram I showed you before, and here it is again in terms of the control structure. So the idea is each of these systems has different mechanisms associated with it, but the common currency is in terms of feelings, in terms of valence, arousal, temporal duration. There's some sort of function. There is some sort of integration function that results in a behavioral response. So different systems will be activated to different extent by different stimuli. The system is set to maximize pleasure and minimize pain or displeasure. There is no central executive in charge. The selected behavior will usually be a blended response based on the output of all systems. The reasoning system has an input into the response, but so do the other systems. Individual differences in behavior are explained not just in terms of individual differences at the level of reasoning, that is at the level of beliefs, but also individual differences at the level of the autonomic, instinctive, and associative systems. A notion of variable individual effort may be captured in this model by variability in levels of arousal associated with different systems. So now let me just give you a couple of examples and then conclude. So let's go back to the parole judge's example that I began with. So given an application with some merit, the reasoning system may generate a rating ranging from neutral to positive. This will be associated with a positive valence and some amount of arousal. If, however, the judge adjudicating the case also happens to be hungry, the autonomic system will be signaling negative valence and high arousal associated with hunger. The two issues are logically unrelated, but neurologically it is one system. Therefore, one can imagine the negative feelings associated with the hunger overpowering or at least dampening down the neutral to positive feelings associated with the evaluation of the case, resulting in a negative parole decision. If the judge has had a good meal prior to the evaluation of the case, the positive feelings of fullness and contentment may well push a neutral or even a negative rating to positive feelings associated with the evaluation of the case over the top and resulting in a positive parole decision, right? So it allows for the interaction of these systems, how these systems can interact. Let me give you one more example. This is the impeachment example, the first impeachment of Donald Trump. And here you can see both the reasoning and the non-reasoning mind at work. So the charge was that Trump pressured Ukraine's president by withholding financial military aid authorized by Congress to get him to build a criminal case against his expected political rival, Joe Biden. Now, there was a legal argument made in the Senate trial, right? This was the reasoning mind at work. And the argument was, if the president does something which he believes will get him reelected, and he believes that his reelection is in the public interest, then that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. Now, this is the reasoning mind at work. Reasons are offered for the president's actions and reasons why they're not impeachable. One can use the reasoning mind to question the coherency and merit of the argument, as did many legal scholars. But what happened in the court of public opinion? No coherent argument was ever made, right? Instead, rhetorical devices invoking well-known reasoning fallacies, such as ad hominem arguments, deflection, focusing on consequences, setting up false dilemmas, and so forth, were consciously, intentionally used to bypass the system of reasoning. It's not that people didn't know how to reason. The whole point was to bypass the system of reasoning, right? So deflection, here's an example of deflection. The real crime is that Joe Biden and the corrupt Democrats are getting away with murder. This is the real story. Well, okay, if true, it requires a separate investigation, but it does not address the coherence relation between the evidence and conclusion regarding the impeachment, right? It's irrelevant. So the impeachment counter strategy was to bypass the system of reasoning and activate the in-group, out-group instinct. Now, as you know, the in-group is always good and beloved of God. The out-group is questionable, is of questionable virtue and beholden to a lesser God. So I make the case in the book that the in-group, out-group formation is an instinct, which in itself is a little bit controversial because social scientists explain it a different way. And the way I say, think about it like imprinting in certain birds. The imprinting is instinctual, but what is imprinted upon is an accidental feature of the environment. Okay? Similarly, in-groups, out-group formation is an instinct, but group membership is environmentally, socially determined. So the instinctive mind is characterized by action-specific appetitive states with valence, pent-up arousal reservoirs, the properties of triggering stimuli, and the pleasurable feelings of the consummatory response. It cannot be changed by beliefs. And so the White House consciously triggered the in-group, out-group instincts to further their agenda. And once this system is activated, the pleasure generated by these systems, the alliance towards the in-group and the hostility towards the out-group, and there's real pleasure associated with this, engaging in this, may be greater than the pleasure associated with the evidence and coherency of the impeachment argument. In the case of the president's supporters, the overpowering feelings of attachment to the in-group and fear and rage directed at the out-group, the Democrats, totally drowned out any pleasure associated with coherency of arguments and completely drove the behavior. Of course, the same applies to Democrats. In the case of the Democrats, the activation of the same in-group, out-group system would direct fear and rage at the Republicans and activate the seeking, fairness, and cheater detection systems, which would hypersensitize them to any evidence of wrongdoing, motivate them to be selective, and enhance their adherence to coherency relations because the evidence seemed to support the wrongdoing by the president. And so there is no satisfactory, purely rational explanation of these behaviors. Okay, final slide and conclusion. So I've covered a lot of ground, much of it new to many of you. And I've done it in a very short space of time. Therefore, the argument may seem very abstract. But my basic message, I think, is quite simple. Human behavior is a blended response generated by autonomic, instinctive, associative, and reasoning systems. Each of these systems is associated with different conceptual and neural machinery. One key insight that holds everything together is that feelings, generated in old, widely conserved brainstem structures, are evolution's solution to initiating and selecting all behaviors, and provide the common currency for the different systems to interact. Reason is as much about feelings as is lust and the taste of chocolate cake. All systems contribute to behavior, and the overall control structure is one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes displeasure. Such an account drives human behavior back into the biology where it belongs and provides a richer set of tools to understand how we pursue food, sex, and politics. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can you please stop sharing your screen? So, thank you very much for this really enriching, dense, and also thought-provoking presentation. I hope I'm having so many thoughts at the same time, and also because I read your book in winter, which triggered me a lot of associations of actually going to have some chocolate cake, which in German is very highly to happen because it's very cold. And I really enjoyed reading the book, especially because you state the case more elaborate than now in the presentation. But really all these different ramifications that, as you also presented, perhaps this controversial idea that we might identify ourselves as rational beings, but actually most of our decisions or our decision making might be mostly influenced by our feelings, by our what normally we very civilized people say maybe our lowest instincts or our more basic intuitions. So my first question is, why do you think that this is still such a controversial statement? Why is that in our culture, or of course we cannot say our culture because there's many, but why is this accepted, this consensus that there's something wrong with the feelings?
Oh, no, it's not. There's two questions there. One is about the feelings. The feelings are the mechanism. The real issue is the fact that these other systems, these lower level base systems, whether they have an input, right? That's the controversial part, I think. Feelings are controversial sort of from an intellectual point of view, in terms of mechanism point of view, can we actually get them to do the work that needs to be done? But the idea that our behavior is not simply driven by reason, by rationality, is not fully under our control. But there are these lower level, whether it be low blood sugar level, and the example I use in my wife before I encounter this data was, the example I use in the book before I encounter this data is I would sometimes, when I was hungry, snap at my wife, and she'd ask, "What's wrong?" I said, "Nothing." And then she sort of figured it out, started carrying some chocolate bars with her. And every time I became grouchy, she'd give me a chocolate bar, that'd be fine. Or the, instinctual systems. So that's what's become problematic. And it's just become problematic recently. And I think it's the Americans' fault. The Americans, you can lay the blame squarely on the Americans and the American dream and the sort of the basic idea of America, that anyone can be anything. Anyone can be president. This is not a European idea. This is not an idea shared around the world. It's a very American idea, I think. And in some ways, it's a very good idea. This is a kind of society you want to live in. But if you take it too seriously, then it distorts the science. And what I think has done in the last 70, the social sciences in America have been very much affected by this sort of this worldview. And
so you would say that, making a distinction between the possibilities of democracy and the consequences of populism, that there is a fine line between theoretically being possible that anyone would be prepared to become president, or just anyone at all becoming president. Is this what you mean?
No. What I'm saying, look, I mean, maybe I shouldn't have brought in America, but since I did, look, what is it to be an American? I've thought about this question often. 1,000 years from now, when they're digging up the remnants of the American Empire, and they want to say, what was their essential idea? What was their core idea? What was it to be an American? I think what they will say is the idea that anyone can be president. Or as Benjamin Franklin said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That idea, that's the idea, right? And that's wrong. Biologically, it's wrong. It's got to be at least 50-50. Like this. And so this is how the social sciences have been, I think, extremely been affected by this idea. And they've pushed aside any biological constraints or considerations when it comes to explaining human behavior. So and there's a history of this. When you read psychology books from up until the 1920s, the idea that I'm presenting is very much in fashion. It's sort of the idea. Right? Darwin talks like this, William James talks like this McDougall and so forth. This is, but then the sort of fulcrum starts to shift. And the first sort of explosion of this actually came in the 1970s with the work of the sociobiology, right? And since then, the pushback against that idea has been extreme. So Edward Wilson, the sort of the father of sociology, he became the most hated academic in the world. He wrote this book, Sociobiology, 26 chapters he wrote. The first 25 chapters, he talked about ants and elephants and chimpanzees, and everyone thought this is the most brilliant book that's been written, in terms of explaining social behavior. Then he added a 26th chapter, humans, and he just used the same explanation, the same structure, the same mechanism. Right? This is what evolution requires that you do. And that brought the hostility, the hate that was directed at him by students, by colleagues, by friends, lasted for decades. And even, at my university, about 10 years ago, we celebrated our 50th anniversary. This was, and we invited Edward Wilson to give a talk. He would have been in his 80s at that time. The grad students from the English and sociology, they put together a petition to try to ban him. Right? It runs deep. And the solution, my point here also is not that we're driven by these systems. We're not. We do have a reasoning mind, but it's a blended response. And how we sort of what we sort of want to do is to learn how we can channel behavior one way or the other, and in directions that we prefer, rather than directions that can be harmful. But to do that, you really want to have as accurate a model as possible. And if you have a model that totally ignores the biology, that just is based on reason, and the reason that the reasoning model, the rationality model, is so convenient, is that to change behavior, all you have to do is change beliefs. Right? This is the basic social psychology, sociology idea. What I'm saying is, yes, but certain beliefs can't be changed as easily. And you can't change certain beliefs by a weekend of sensitivity training. That there are. That's not to say you can't change them at all, but you have to recognize that there are different mechanisms at work, and then you have to understand what those mechanisms are in particular cases, and then how you would intervene. Sometimes maybe associative training. Sometimes it may require a pharmaceutical intervention. I mean, once you understand the sort of the brain systems involved.
So now I would have a question apropos this, which is it's a question for you, but it's also a question in general for maybe the whole neuroscience community, because as someone who is also trying to learn about neuroscience and in connection with architecture, and also in a broader, trying to understand humans in a broader sense, I wonder about the ethical considerations, because I have to say that I grew up watching a lot of films, and I'm still a bit of a film fanatic. And one of my favorites is Clockwork Orange from Stanley Kubrick. And I have to think about, I don't know if you remember, or if you're...
I don't. I'm sure I've seen it. I don't remember it. Yeah.
I think it would be interesting for you within the context of your book, maybe to take a look at this, exactly because of the question I'm going to do. Because in this film, we have a character who is a pretty problematic character. He's basically a kind of sociopath. He's a member of a gang. He's actually the leader of the gang, and he spent his day basically driven by all the basic emotions. So his day runs around the pursuit of food, sex, violence, aggression, and also the fight to maintain his alpha dog position within the group, all sorts of destruction, and so on. And at a certain point in the film, due to a sequence of events, he ends up being taken as a patient to be rehabilitated by an institution, where he goes through a procedure of what we could call maybe reconditioning, where the people who work with him try to transform the things that he enjoyed the most into things that he would detest. So they trigger him by triggering aversive mechanisms by looking at the films and listening to the music he most enjoys, which is Ludwig von Beethoven, his hero. So what happens is that when he leaves the institution and he goes out into the world, whenever he has a violent instinct, he starts, he has a gag reflex. He almost vomits because he can't cope with the instinct anymore. It was suppressed through this process. So we also see that somehow that intervention was somehow also violent, because he's not able to express himself anymore, and something that gave him so much joy became a source of horrible suffering. And then the film makes another turn that he's taken as a kind of an orphan, so to be again rehabilitated by the family or the husband of the person who actually he abused, and that led to his going to the institution.
Okay.
So he's taken as a victim of society, and so on and so on. So I think you would really enjoy. So basically, of course, as in any Stanley Kubrick thing, there's no clear moral, but there's a lot of questions around this. So my question that comes with this is, in how far the understanding of these mechanisms can make us able to decide which are ethical interventions that can actually have a good outcome, and in how far should we interfere in these processes? And also my second question in connection to this, and also thinking about this character more as a symbol of our maybe impulses, in how far do we really have any control in these impulses? Or also in your presentation, you also mentioned that of course we have a degree of control, but insofar they are always behind our decision making.
Yeah, and often we will go back and rationalize the decision, but yeah. So okay, I'm going to go back and watch Clockwork Orange. It raises a number of relevant issues. I remember it. It was when I was a student in high school or something. It was one of the books, and so it's many years ago that I read it. But I'm going to go back and look at it. Now, another way of asking the question that you're asking is if what I'm saying is correct, if this is the model, if this is really how human behavior works, then can we even hold people responsible for behavior that harms others? Right? So in the case of sexual harassment and so forth, this comes up. And this is one of the examples that I use in the book. And so there are, this is extremely problematic. And I'm actually, the next book I'm writing, I'm trying to address this issue. Okay, because both socially and legally, our notion of responsibility is very tightly connected to our notion of rationality. You can't disconnect the two. I can't figure out yet how to disconnect the two. We only hold people responsible. So if someone is rational, we hold them responsible for their behavior. And the only excusing condition for responsibility is the lack of rationality at that particular point. Right? So we need to work out a system where we can hold people responsible, even if the model actually says it's not completely, our behaviors are not completely rational. One legal scholar put it like this: the behavior is what the mind tells the body to do, as far as the law is concerned, right? And no, this is not what behavior is, as far as neuroscience is concerned. So how do we reconstrue our social institutions, our legal institutions, such that we can recognize the actual sort of the motivators, the levers of these behaviors, and yet still have a accountability, still hold people responsible for behavior that harms others. And one way is the medical model, right? Even if someone is declared insane or not criminally responsible for a particular behavior, we can still remove them from society for their protection and protection of others, right? And so maybe we need to get away from this idea of revenge, of retribution. If someone harms you, they have to be harmed. They have to be, we need retribution. That's what much of punishment is, right? And only in certain small cases, we are moving away from that to a medical model to, well, maybe retribution is not the thing. Yes, they've done something terrible. What we want to make sure is they don't do, this doesn't happen again, that they're not in a position to harm someone else. And so either is there some intervention we can take that will prevent them from harming someone else? We remove them from society, right? So there's a lot to be fleshed out there. And I think this is the biggest obstacle to getting widespread acceptance to a model that recognizes non-cognitive components to human beings. And here I'm not, see, the choice is not between the standard model and the tethered rationality model. No, the choice is between the standard model and a model that recognizes non-cognitive components. And the tethered rationality model I'm offering is just one instantiation of that. I'm just saying, okay, maybe this is how it's done. Maybe it's not. So that is up for grabs. But I think what's got to be a truism is that there are non-cognitive components associated with it, with behavior.
And just before giving the word here to the students, to give them the chance for the questions, I would go back again to this thought we had in the beginning of our exchange now about the rejection. There seems to be a pattern in the rejection of this idea that most of our reasoning is affected by biological components, so to say, because already with Darwin, his theory was also not accepted when he presented it. So humans seem to have a real problem accepting their own animal nature.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe you could make a comment on that.
Yeah, and it's a different problem. So the problem with Darwin's, for the first 2,000 years, was integrating, there's something special about us and compared to non-human animals. And what's special about us is that we reason. And the explanation for our reason, for our ability to reason, was God's grace, right? We had this soul that God gave us, not the other animals. And it's this soul that allows us to reason. And it floats above the animal passion that we also inherit from the other animals. So it's the biology. And so that idea was widely accepted. And what it allowed to do, it allowed us to take into consideration both components. But with Darwin, what happens is that that clear-cut distinction is done away with. And then with the biology, there has to be a natural explanation for our ability to reason. And we sort of have come some ways down that road. And I think our rejection today is really a function of the influence of the social sciences. And to see the benefit, the social benefit, if you're interested in social policy, if you want to shape social policy, then it's absolutely essential for you that it's all about reason. Because then you can change it by changing beliefs. You can mold people into any way that you want by simply changing their beliefs. And that's easy compared to changing other things, right? If there are sort of underlying instinctual factors, for example, as in lust or my desire for chocolate cake, you can't, you can tell me if I eat too much chocolate cake that I'm going to get diabetes, I'm going to get fat and heart disease and so forth. And I could believe you, but cake tastes good. And you can convince me it's better for me to eat apples than chocolate cake. And intellectually, I can believe you. But that doesn't change my preference, that the fact that I like the taste of chocolate cake better than the taste of apples. I can begrudgingly eat apples sometimes, and I can use my cognitive brain not to buy chocolate cake at sometimes, but it doesn't change the underlying mechanisms, the beliefs. And it's the same thing. You know, in the book, the detailed, deep down examples that I give are of lust and taste, the chocolate. But think of you know, those of you that have children. The pain that you suffer when your child is suffering. And you know, your child could do something horrendous like a mass shooting. You know, these poor parents whose children go out and shoot 20, 30 people. And they know that this is horrific and this wrong, but this doesn't change the feeling, the attachment that you have for your child, to protect your child, to see your child thrive. You know, this is not something that was socially learned. You can certainly reinforce it socially, and so this is important in terms of the details. Is there are excellent examples where different societies, different basic instincts get either reinforced or pushed against. And you can see where in some societies, it might be 90% because they get reinforced. In others, it might be 30% because they get pushed against. But in no society is it 0 or 100%. So this interaction between societal norms, social norms, which are, you know, which are determined, set by beliefs and by social conditioning. You know, we can see, and I think we're at a stage in North America and probably Europe also, where the social sciences have dominated the intellectual discourse now, and much more than they should have. They've overplayed their hand. And there needs to be some sort of pushback. The social sciences are important. Socialization, you know, is absolutely critical. But what you're socializing is not a blank slate. You're socializing an organism that has all this biological structure built in to it, and so you have to respect that structure, and if you take the detail, understand the details of that structure, you will be more successful in pushing the organism in one direction versus another direction, rather than just simply hammering on beliefs.
I would have here a question about the role of self-determination within this process, but I don't want to dominate all the discussion. So maybe we leave it for the end, or I would like to take a question from here, from our students. No? Okay, maybe they'll need a little time, and then maybe we can pick up on this topic of self-determination. Maybe I'm still influenced because of the whole Clockwork Orange scenario that I described before, but when we talk about intervening in such a process, and you use this expression, if we expect to mold people's behavior or attitudes or change their beliefs in something, this triggers in me this question. So what about self-determination? What about the individual by itself having or in how far is it ethical to intervene in this process? So what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, the ethics are that's a very difficult question, but we do it. So, for example, look in the case of people with psychiatric disorders. We can intervene in terms of depriving them of their freedom for various reasons, or we can intervene pharmaceutically. So, if a patient with paranoid schizophrenia, you can talk to them and talk to them and talk to them. It makes no difference. Give them neuroleptic, and they're sort of okay and can sort of function. We have intervened in terms of their behavior. The more drastically, you remember, well, you won't remember, obviously, I don't remember either, but during the 1940s and 50s, lobotomies were very fashionable. And this is an extremely drastic, unfortunate intervention. And not of just anyone, but some very highly wealthy, influential people had their children lobotomized. One of the Kennedys was lobotomized because they were so difficult to control, and that seemed to alter their behavior so that it was more acceptable, right? So we have done, or think of in terms of more criminal cases, in case of serial rape or something, castration, right, has been used in certain cases, and it works. It damps down that system. You can't talk someone out of it, but so these are examples. Now the question is, how do we sort of incorporate them? Currently what we do when we someone has harmed someone, others, or not behaving in the way society thinks they should behave, is we remove them from society, and we think they should also be punished. It's just not enough that we don't remove them from society and put them in a comfortable home. Typically, you get put in a prison, and the idea is not only are you removed from society, you have done something wrong and you must pay for it, right? And maybe that's what we need to get over. Mm-hmm. That and there are arguments from neuroscience involving determinism, that all our behaviors are determined anyways. And so, if I did, suppose I overrun a stop sign, and or even I intentionally shoot someone, right? Well, I was destined to do so, right? The deterministic arguments would lead you to believe that. And so then
I was a little bit scary.
Well, yes, no, and there's a literature on this. There's interesting literature on this. So then the question becomes so then if that's the case, why can you punish me? Right? What's the justification for punishing me? Because it wasn't my fault. It wasn't, it was predetermined. And then all you can do is, well, we can still remove you from society. We still need to protect society. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so maybe that's the route we need to go to. Right now, we're still very much stuck on retribution. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
I would have so many questions, but I'm giving the word to Milton, and I don't know if Fred Marks would also like to make a comment. He's also here with us, and then we will have to finish. We are already a little bit over time here in the classroom. Okay. Hey, Milton, go ahead.
Vinod, hi.
Hello, Milton.
Listened carefully to your talk, but I was wondering if I could change the subject slightly to relate to some research that I've read of yours and Ocean Vartanian's. See if I can ask you to connect some dots to architectural preferences directly, because the article I was looking at, there may be ones that already answer this question, but the one I looked at had to do with preference for paintings and a preference for representational over abstract, for original condition rather than filtered visuals for selection or for response. And most particularly, the part that's most interesting to me is the correlation between time of attention and pleasure. So taking that to architectural experience, my question is whether you have done research or you have your very informed opinions about how that kind of research would go if it was research about architecture. Perhaps the differentiation would be between different kinds of traditional architecture and modern architecture, which tends to be more abstract, et cetera.
Okay. Yeah. So I've been meaning to come back and sort of think about architecture along these lines. And there are 2 or 3 things that I think would have to change drastically. So I've written about architecture in the past, but always from a cognitive perspective, right? It's all about cognition. Even when we were doing the works and the paintings, cognition was not far from our mind. This is how we were trained. This is how we think about the world. And so now, I'm hoping when I get around to writing about architecture using these ideas, it would be much more about associative operant conditioning mechanisms and instinctive mechanisms. I've become very interested in some. There's 3-4 books about one is called The Art Instinct, one is called that try to give you an evolutionary story of what we find, pleasant in art or unpleasant, or what sort of the common themes are. And that can be applied, I think, also to architecture, and probably works better with architecture than with art. Also, are you familiar with the very old, well, not, I mean, I guess it is now very old, 20 years, by Seymour Zecchi, called Vision, Art and Vision? Yeah. Yes. That I read 15 years ago. And while Zecchi doesn't have a deep understanding of art, at least at that time he didn't, I thought there was a deep insight in that book when he discussed the question of why we prefer certain abstract paintings over others. Okay, which is, or why we prefer this realistic painting over others. And the answer that he gave was a very simple answer based upon how the perceptual system works. So as you know, in the primary visual cortex, we have these cell detectors, and they detect simple things like angles of a line, nature of a curve, and what he was saying is that certain paintings may, or are maybe preferred over others because they maximally activate those cells. So the way the system is set up is that if you've got a cell detector, that it might be maximally activated when the line is like this, but it'll still get activated when the line is like this, less. And so the artists that hit more often upon angles, colors, curves that maximally activate these cells, we have a preference for them. So I thought that was an interesting idea that is worth considering. Now, the evolutionary people may tell you a story about why that is, why we should prefer a curve of a certain type over other types. So that's the direction I think that we need to go into.
That'd be very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, my contribution, this is Fred Marks. Milton, you'll know that Gombrich also touches this subject in terms of preferences.
I will agree with EH.
I agree that certain lines will activate cells more than others. And Tom Albright, as a vision perception specialist, and Sergei Gepstein can also talk about this from a neuroscience point of view. So my contribution today is that I would encourage everyone who's attending to watch Clockwork Orange again, if not for the first time. I had the pleasure of seeing it about 2 months ago. I'm a charter member of the U.S. Academy Museum here in Los Angeles, and they had an absolutely gorgeous restored 35 millimeter print that we all had a chance to see, plus a lecture before it started. It is a very complex movie. I think I'm still learning from it. Your synopsis was marvelous in terms of how the story is projected and the questions that are left at the end of it. And it does very much have to do with this issue of the mind, both rational and irrational. So,
and let me just interject there, Fred. So you use the word irrational. So I make a distinction between irrational and irrational. So irrational is just a failure of the coherence relation. But irrational is when you're driven by other non-rational systems like instinctive systems, associative systems, autonomic systems. So
Okay,
that I think is helpful, or personally, I find it useful.
good. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Always wonderful to share thoughts with you. And I would have loved to share this experience because Clockwork Orange is my all-time favorite film. I think I might have seen it maybe 50 times. And I have a screen print from it at home because my husband is an architect and also studied film and shares my obsession for film. So I am, yeah, it's very special for me. And Vinod, I think you will enjoy it immensely. And
I'm going to look for it tonight, see if I can find it online somewhere.
I think you can. You can take a look at maybe at Movie, or perhaps in Prime, Amazon Prime. They
Okay.
could also have
Okay.
it. Okay, so we really have to finish for now, but
Okay.
we will continue this. I have a few more thoughts, but we will continue this in the summer. Okay. So thank you everyone for being here and for your attention. And thank you so much, Vinod. This was very interesting today.
No, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Bye now.
Bye-bye.